Okay, so in this tutorial we're going to build your first iPhone application using Xcode. It's going to be an extremely simple application, and we're going to use that really simple application as a way to take a tour through Xcode, see what the different panels are, see what it's doing so you can be more comfortable with the interface. So that said, let's get started. We're going to create, I've got the Xcode welcome screen open here, and we're going to create a new project. And first, it'll ask you what kind of template you want to use for this project, and it gives you a bunch of starter templates that you can use to get your project off and running quickly. We're going to use the single view application. Later, we'll go and see what some of these other templates are, but we'll start off with the single view application. So, under iOS, select single view application and click Next. Then it's going to ask you what do you want to name it. Well, for this project, as a standard in when you're building any kind of first application in any language, we'll call this Hello World. We'll use this project to announce your new coding skills to the world. So I typed Hello World into the product name, capital H, capital W, all one word. And as for a company identifier, really you can put anything in here. This is just a way for you to keep different projects organized. For this tutorial, it doesn't really matter what you put in here. What does matter though is the device family. Make sure you've got iPhone selected. If you wanted to build an iPad app, you could select that here. Universal is for building one project that would work on both iPhones and iPads. But for now, we're going to stick with iPhone. Then you want to make sure that use storyboarding and use automatic reference counting are selected. We will get into what exactly these do. Well, storyboarding you're going to see in this application, and automatic reference counting we'll talk about later. But make sure those two are checked, and then click Next. It's going to ask you where you want to save your files. It doesn't really matter. I put all of these tutorial files in one location on your computer, so you might want to create a folder for that. You do have this option at the bottom for source control, create local Git repository. We'll talk about that in a different tutorial, but for now I'll just leave that unchecked. And when you've got the right location selected, create. Oops, I've already created this Hello World project, so it's asking me if I want to replace it. I'm going to do that. This shouldn't pop up for you. And then it'll go ahead and create your project, and eventually you should find yourself on a window that looks like this. So what's happening in this window? It looks like, oh my gosh, it's throwing a ton of stuff at you in the beginning. We're going to start off on the left-hand side of the window here, and you notice that in each pane that Xcode gives you, there's often a little gray bar at the top here, which works as a little tab control, where you can select different buttons to see different options within that pane. Make sure the leftmost button is selected there, and that'll show your project navigator. So in using that single view application template, Xcode created a whole bunch of files for you as a starting point and what it thinks you're going to need. And you can see all those files that were created here. The files are created and organized within these folders that you can expand and collapse. These folders are called groups. So I've got my Hello World project and 3 groups of files underneath that. The main group here has 5 files within it and another group inside of it as well. Know that you can organize, this shows all the files that are in your application, but if you move these files around, the actual files on your computer won't move. This just is a way for you to organize the files when you're working with the project in Xcode. And while the files exist, your organization here does not map to the actual organization of files on your computer. So feel free to move these around however you want to by clicking and dragging them into different folders and whatnot. We will talk later about the function of the .h and .m files. But for now, click on the main storyboard file. When you click on any file, you can then edit that file within the main pane here in Xcode. Your storyboard file is where you're going to lay out the visual representation of your application, how the user interface is going to look for each screen in your application. Xcode has already given you one screen as part of that template. And that's this screen in here. Each screen on the storyboard is called a scene. So I've got my first scene here on the storyboard. And if I were to run this application right now, all I would have is a white screen with a little gray bar at the top. Pretty uninteresting application. So our application is called Hello World. What we want it to do is to display the text Hello World to the world when we run our application. To do that, we're going to add a user interface element to the application. We do that by taking user interface element from the right hand side of the window here. This right hand side is called the utilities pane. I can show or hide the utilities pane by selecting this toggle button at the top. When the utilities pane is showing, it's broken into two smaller panes, each with their little gray bar at the top. On the bottom pane, I've got a bunch of different libraries. So the leftmost library is a bunch of files that are a file template library with a bunch of files that are written for me that I could use. I've got a code snippet library next to that with a bunch of code blocks that are already written for me to use. And next to that I've got an object library with a bunch of user interface elements that I could use in my application. Well, great, that's exactly what I want. I want to select this object library, and within that I can see all these user interface elements, and I can see them in one of two ways. I can see them in this grid form, or by clicking on this button here, I can switch it to list view, and it'll give me a short description of what each one of these user interface elements is. I'm going to drag out a label control, and when I click on it, it'll pop up a window giving me a brief description of what this label control does. Labels allow me to display text on the screen, and since I want to display the text Hello World, that's what I'll use. So I'm going to click and drag this label control from the library and onto my scene. Now it's just big enough to hold the world label, and I'm going to switch it to displaying the words Hello World. So I'm going to need that to be a bit wider. Each one of these round circles is a element that I can click and drag to change the size of that label control. So I'm going to click that right side and drag it out to make it a bit longer. And then I can click and drag the entire label control to recenter it on the scene, and I get these little guide bars that help me out doing that. Okay, it says label, I want to say Hello World. Well, just above that object library then, I've got this other panel with a bunch of inspectors, as we call them. We'll talk about what a lot of these other inspectors do later, but the main one I'm interested in right now is the one that's fourth from the left, called the Attributes Inspector. I really don't know what that symbol is supposed to represent, but know that the fourth from the left is the Attributes Inspector. And when I click on it, and I have that label control selected, I can edit all the attributes of that label control. So the text right now says label. I'm going to change that to Hello World. Enter. And then you see that the text of that label control will change to Hello World. I can change the number of lines it is. I can change the alignment of it. I want it to be centered rather than off to left justified. I can change the font size. I can change the text color. I'm going to change that by clicking on it and selecting green. Now I just made this label control longer by dragging out the edge. If I knew the exact size I wanted it to be, I could use the inspector next to the Attributes Inspector, which is the Size Inspector. And here I could lay out the exact X and Y coordinates I wanted that label control to be at, as well as its exact width and height if I had specific designs for that. Below that, I could also change how that label control will react when the when the iPhone is rotated. We'll deal with that in a different tutorial. So now I've got my app built. This is all I wanted to do. I wanted to display Hello World. So now I want to see how it's going to look in an actual running on an iPhone. I can do that by making sure on the upper left-hand side of Xcode that my iPhone 5.0 simulator is the selected scheme, and then I can press this play button. And what it will do is take all those files and build them into an application, and then run them in an iPhone simulator, which will appear in front of me. So now I can see my application running and how it will look in an iPhone. Cool. Doesn't do a whole lot at the moment, but there's a couple of cool things I can do with this simulator that are really helpful as I'm looking at my application. If I select hardware, I can rotate the iPhone to the right and see what it's going to look like when the user rotates their iPhone around. Great. I want to rotate that back. I could also do simulate a shake, what would happen when the user shakes their phone. Right now my application doesn't do anything. We didn't write any code for handling that situation. I can also, this simulator works just like an iPhone. So if I press the home button, I will go back out to the iPhone menu. And I can shift left and right. I've got a little icon for my application. It's pretty boring. I haven't set the graphics for that yet. But I can click back into my application as well and relaunch it. So, you've built your first iPhone application. It doesn't do a whole lot, but by working through this tutorial, you got to see what the basic values that are created when you build this template are. You got to see where your project navigator is and how to navigate between different files in your application, how to pull up the user interface for an application and put a label control on it, and how to adjust all the attributes of any control you put in your application in the attributes inspector. Then you got to see how that you have an iPhone simulator and how to use that simulator to see how your application will look when it's actually running. So that's your basic orientation to Xcode, and in later tutorials we'll get deeper into how to use Xcode to build more sophisticated applications.